Good morning to you in Australia. I'm honored to be with you, even though it's in spirit. I'm very upset I cannot be with you this morning in person or throughout the conference. I really hope I can do it next time, but conditions were such that I couldn't travel. So let me be with you in spirit and take a little bit of this time to go over a few issues that we have been working on for a long time in terms of corruption, anti-corruption, and governance. I know how much expertise there is in the room right now, among you, among the expert fellow panelists that are with you. What I try to contribute a little bit is in terms of the international experience and in terms of the power of data in that context. You are the experts on Australia, so I'm not going to weigh in too much in the context of Australia, except in terms of the data to show a little bit how Australia fares in that international comparison. But the first point I'd like to stress up front, which has driven much of the work that we have been doing for a very long time, is that one cannot fight corruption by fighting corruption alone. One has to go further than that. Just adopting another law against corruption is not the solution, especially not these days, where the laws are not most of the problem. In most countries, they have the laws. The problem is the implementation of the laws, but as important, the problem lies in the weak institutional frameworks, in the weak governance framework, which are more fundamental reasons for the presence of corruption. So we see corruption in some sense as a symptom of institutional vulnerability, a very costly symptom, but nonetheless a symptom. So it's been very important in driving our work to start from a broader notion of governance. 15 years ago, we started a major project. I was at the time at the World Bank with a partner, with another researcher, Art Cray. We define governance as a set of rules and institutions by which authority in a country is exercised. As we see in this slide, basically we unbundle that notion of the institutions by which authority in a country is exercised. We unbundle it into three different clusters, major clusters of governance: the political dimension, the economic dimension, and the institutional respect dimension. Each one of these clusters or dimensions, in turn, we translated into two measurable indicators for a set of 6 governance indicators. The first cluster, as I mentioned, is the political one. It's a process by which those in authority are selected and replaced, and the two measurable indicators are voice and accountability, and the extent to which there is a free press, democratic accountability, civil society able to operate and make government accountable. The second and very important dimension of political governance is political stability and the absence of violence and terrorism. Then the more economic dimension or cluster of governance is by which we mean the capacity of government to formulate and implement policies and provide public services to the citizens, is also unbundled into two measurable indicators: the extent to which the government, the public sector, institutions function effectively, the effectiveness of the government, of the bureaucracy, as well as another key function of the government, the quality of the regulatory framework. And the third and very important cluster is that one of institutional respect, is the respect of citizens and state for the institutions that govern interactions among them. And that, again, is unbundled into two measurable indicators. One is the quality of the application of rule of law. Rule of law is absolutely critical. And last but not least is control of corruption. By so doing, by putting in this framework, in essence, we're doing two things. One is putting in context the issue of control of corruption. Control of corruption and governance are not synonymous. Just like rule of law and governance are not synonymous. Governance is it's broader than that. And second, if it is the case, which is very clearly in the data and in the research, that in order to control corruption, one has to address the weaknesses in governance and institutions, generally it's very important to have that broader analytical framework and the data at hand to see where do these vulnerabilities lie that may be causing corruption. Is there an absence of voice and accountability? Is there serious weaknesses with the judiciary, rule of law, or in the regulatory framework, or so on? Not to bore you too much, especially from afar to that, I'm not going to explain the methodology or the fact that we collect thousands and thousands of data points from 30 different sources from around the world. We've been doing this since the late 90s until now, and annually we produce this analysis and a data set which is called the Worldwide Governance Indicators, as we see in this slide now. For the rule of law, this is a governance map of the world. For the case of one of the indicators, rule of law, it's coded in traffic light type of form going from green to red. This is also to suggest that one ought not try to be overly precise and have a full sense of precision, but they are broad categories of countries in that case. One can zoom in. This is all in the web, by the way, and go to a region of interest. In this case, is Asia Pacific, where one sees that Australia, in terms of rule of law, is in the green category. Other countries are more challenged in the region, as we see, but there are other countries in the green, like Japan, New Zealand, Singapore, and so on. The same can be done, as we see in this next slide, with control of corruption, both for the world and for zooming in now into the East Asia and Pacific region. But also one can go to the specific data and generate any kind of graphics tailored to the need of the analyst or the policy maker or the journalist. In this case, I've just put one slide that we see in front of us, where each column is one country among 20 or so in the East Asia Pacific region, where we see, according to the latest data, the latest update of this indicator we just released with the data up to the end of 2014, and we see that Australia, relatively speaking, rates quite highly in terms of control of corruption. But it's no longer, used to be for a bit in the late 2000s, it's no longer in the top 10 in the world, although quite close to it. And there are countries even in the region, like New Zealand and Singapore, that rate a bit higher. In fact, Australia, if I'm not mistaken, but one has to consider margins of error, Australia is number 11th now. But then, as we can see in this graph, there are many other countries with much more challenges. And of course, it's noteworthy not only to mention among the countries performing well, Australia, Singapore, New Zealand, but also Japan, Hong Kong, and a few others. But that's in sharp contrast with many others in the region. And that's normal in every region. And I come from Latin America, from Chile. There's enormous variation in the region. So it's very risky to generalize for a region. Does this matter? That's the next question. So it could be interesting data. How much does this matter for a country's prospects, development, socioeconomic and political development? The brief answer is enormously. It matters by 300%. What do I mean by 300%? 300% is the development dividend of improved governance and controlling corruption in a country. A country that implements reforms and goes from being relatively corrupt to not so corrupt. No country has no corruption, but it has a significant improvement without going from one extreme to the other. Only 1/5 from one extreme to the other. In fact, it's one standard deviation. A country that improves in that sense by taking the required reforms in the long term can expect a tripling of its per capita income, going from $20,000 per capita per year to $60,000, or from 5 to 15. It's an enormous payoff, and it's causal, the link. And that research we have done, others have done it. It's causal. It goes from improving governance and controlling corruption to higher incomes. It also has been shown, our research and others, it improves the health prospects, whether infant mortality or maternal mortality, improves educational prospects, investments, both domestic and foreign direct investment, and it also reduces inequality. So the payoff is enormous at many levels. It also has some political payoffs. That payoff, that dividend, is particularly acute, even more so than in general, for resource-rich countries. So it's a myth to consider that having been blessed with resources, whether oil, gas, or mining, is a substitute to having good governance because one can rely on those resources. In fact, there are many, many countries around the world, and it has been labeled by some as a resource curse, that have not been able to develop properly, and they are very, very rich in natural resources. So we see that very clearly in this graph. In fact, the very dark blue column showing the extent of the payoff for resource-rich countries. So this is another important insight that comes out from research. Another aspect that is very important in terms of the payoff of better governance and controlling corruption is competitiveness around the globe. Global competitiveness nowadays is extremely important. If we look, for instance, at the World Economic Forum Global Competitiveness Index, the link that exists between the quality of institutions, governance, and control of corruption in particular, on the one hand, and the rankings in terms of Global Competitiveness Index is very, very close. And there, obviously, again, Australia, we see it in this graph with a yellow arrow, ranks relatively well in terms of the Global Competitive Index, but it's not in the top 10 of the world, or even top 15. It's in the 20-something in terms of the ranks, and there may be lessons in terms of other countries. But of course, there are many other countries, 125 or so other countries that rank below. This illustrates the importance and the power of data in drawing inferences and the importance of this field. More specifically, in terms of natural resources, there are aspects of governance which are very important in terms of transparency and accountability throughout the value and decision-making chain, from the moment that one decides to explore and then extracting the resources and utilizing them well for development and so on. And in that context, another initiative that we have embarked in the past few years, and this is part of my organization, Natural Resource Governance Institute, the initiative is the Resource Governance Index. 2013, we had one, we're going to have another one in the next year. Australia ranks quite high, it's in the top 5 among 58 countries, at least in Western Australia, the region that we looked at, in terms of some basic aspects of transparency and accountability in natural resources, even though every country, and one can go, as we see in this next slide, every country, including Australia, has areas that one can also improve. Particularly a challenging area is transparency and accountability in terms of the subnational dimension at the provincial level, and it varies from provinces to province. The other pending area, very much for countries like Australia, is joining international initiatives which are very important for transparency, like the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative for full disclosure. I sit in the international board of it, and we will be extremely pleased and welcoming to Australia if it were to join. After Australia, we see another sheet with a lot of detail in terms of the resource governance index of how Indonesia rates for comparison, and we have the same for 58 different countries which we rated in 2013, and soon, and we're working already in the next one. But again, it's extremely important for governance purposes and for understanding the corruption vulnerabilities in natural resources to have a very detailed framework. And the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative provides one, and as we complement it with a natural resource charter that we have put forth from our organization, where we looked essentially at the vulnerabilities to corruption and to governance across the chain. As I mentioned, in terms of discovery and deciding to extract or not, there are many vulnerabilities that come in terms of the license allocation process, and there are case studies that we're working on related to Angola and Chad in terms of getting a good deal. Then how does a country get a good deal with the multinationals and with the companies and so on? There is also corruption often in subcontracting, for instance. The case of Petrobras is an emblematic case that we are all studying very much in detail and drawing lessons about the networks of corruption, which are also multinational in many cases. Also, this corruption vulnerability in terms of the commodity sales, how oil is being sold, what kind of swap contracts have taken place in Nigeria, where billions have been lost in that context. And so on. There are many others such examples. We see some illustrations in this slide of corruption across the decision-making chain, but it's to illustrate the importance of looking at it rigorously, methodically, from the beginning of the value and decision-making chain. Let me just make a few interrelated points. The first is what I started with, is that in addressing corruption, the quality of governance matters, and it matters enormously. So one has to look at the overall governance framework. Second, we emphasize the power of data, the importance of evidence-based decision-making, gathering and analyzing data and information through tools like the Natural Resource Charter, Resource Governance Index, the Worldwide Governance Indicators, and many others that are out there. Nowadays, there are many of such empirical potent tools to do this analysis. The third point is the absolute paramount importance of transparency, transparency being the best disinfectant. But this is particularly important in a field that has been so opaque for so long, which is natural resources and oil, gas, and mining. There is improvement, but for instance, in terms of the commodity traders, there's still much more to go ahead. Some of the oil companies are still very opaque. Some mining companies are making significant effort forward, but it's very varied, the picture. And in that context, let me repeat again, the importance of embracing international global frameworks like the EITI, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, but also another trend that has departed the station is the mandatory disclosure requirements mandated by law in terms of the companies having to disclose what their revenues, payments are to governments as a precondition of being listed in exchange market, in stock markets. And that's happened already, and it's being implemented in the UK because of the European Union directives, soon in other countries. In the US, soon implementation, we expect it, and we will start. Canada has really made enormous strides in that context, and we are keen to also work with Australia in terms of progress in that very aspect. The whole issue of anti-bribery legislation internationally as mandated by OECD is very important. That was adopted a long time ago, but the implementation varies significantly. The quality of implementation of enforcement between jurisdiction and jurisdiction, with countries like the United States ahead of quite a few others, and a number of countries in Asia have stayed behind a bit in terms of enforcement. So that's another very important dimension in this context. But these measures, transparency-related measures, and some are not enough. They have to be, so they are absolutely necessary, but they are insufficient on their own. They have to be complemented by providing the enabling environment for civil society, for NGOs, for think tanks, and for academics to help making government accountable, but also helping in this, creating millions and millions of auditors rather than relying only on the public sector. Rule of law is crucial. We have discussed that. Economic and financial management, meritocracy in the public sector is absolutely key. That's an area of major strength in a country like Australia and a number of others like in Japan and New Zealand, but it's far from universal. Today, there may be a major window of opportunity for governance reforms in countries where there are key issues that are pending. The confluence, in some sense a perfect storm of low commodity prices, the fact that many corruption scandals have erupted, thanks in part to better methods in terms of disclosure, transparency, NGOs, tools, and others that have come upon. There are scandals nowadays in many countries in the world. There is also the evidence of less tolerance regarding impunity and corruption by the citizenry, by civil society, and as a result, there is much more pressure for increased accountability, and we see that in terms of demonstrations and pressures for reform in so many countries. Brazil is an emblematic case now, but let me finish also with a personal note. My own country, Chile, which I'm very proud of and which rates so well in terms of governance and so on, we just faced a major corruption scandal in terms of illegal political finance by the financial sector, and it was major for Chile's context. The key is not to rate a country in terms of governance or corruption by the absence of misgovernance or the absence of corruption. That exists everywhere in the very rich world as well. The point is to see and to view a country according to its capacity and its preparedness politically to respond and institutionally to respond and the leadership to respond when a major challenge or a scandal arises. And that's where I'm very optimistic about the case of Chile. We're going to come out even stronger after that. Major reforms have been proposed. Civil society is extremely involved, including academics and including think tanks and so on in this. The politicians are feeling much pressure and the incentive to implement those reforms. And this is in an era of very low copper prices where there is much more pressure to do that than during the boom years that we faced over the past 12 years. So let me end with a personal note, but suggesting that the time to act, the opportunity to implement reforms that may be pending is now. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and have a great morning. I know that you are having now the next speakers were absolutely wonderful and in fact friends of mine. So I hope you have a very enjoyable day and second day of the conference. Thank you very much.